The day the sun rose twice. At 7:14 in the morning local time on November the 1st, 1952, a small island in the Western Pacific simply ceased to exist. Not damaged, not flattened, erased. Where Elugelab had stood, a thumbnail of palm trees, sand and coral on the northern rim of Enewetak Atoll, there was now a hole in the ocean. A crater nearly 6,240 feet across and 164 feet deep, slowly filling with steaming seawater. Overhead, a mushroom cloud was already punching into the stratosphere, climbing so fast that within minutes it would tower 25 miles above the Pacific and spread 100 miles wide. 30 miles south, aboard the command ship USS Estes, an observer would later write that the fireball appeared on the horizon like the sun when half risen. 50 miles out, aboard a tiny raft bobbing on the open Pacific, the oceanographer Walter Monk pulled on high-density welder's goggles in the pre-dawn darkness and felt an instant heat blast against his face. The kind of warmth you feel from a furnace through a thin wall. The device that produced this spectacle had a code name that sounded like something from a cartoon strip. They called it the Sausage. It was the size of a 2-story factory building. It weighed 82 tons. And it released the explosive equivalent of 10.4 million tons of TNT. That is roughly 700 times the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. It was about 3 times the total tonnage of every single bomb dropped in the entire Second World War combined. This is the story of Ivy Mike, the test that proved humanity could now destroy not merely cities, but entire civilizations. It is a story of physics, politics, betrayal, espionage, and the displaced people of a coral atoll that most Americans have never heard of. And it is the story of how, in a single fraction of a second over a Pacific lagoon, the rules of war and the meaning of national security were rewritten forever. To understand why Ivy Mike happened, you have to understand what the atomic bomb could not do. The weapons of 1945, Little Boy over Hiroshima and Fat Man over Nagasaki, worked by nuclear fission. They split the nuclei of heavy atoms like uranium-235 or plutonium-239. When a neutron strikes such a nucleus, it breaks apart into smaller fragments, releases enormous energy and ejects more neutrons that split more nuclei. Done quickly enough in a critical mass compressed by precisely timed high explosives, this chain reaction unleashes a city-killing detonation. But fission has a ceiling. Each splitting atom releases about 200 million electron volts. That is a staggering amount per nucleus, but it is limited by the physics of how much fissile material can be held together long enough to react before the bomb tears itself apart. By 1952, American weaponeers had pushed the pure fission design about as far as it could go. The Ivy King test exploded just 2 weeks after Mike on November the 16th, 1952, used roughly 60 kilograms of highly enriched uranium and produced 500 kilotons. That was very near the practical limit for a fission-only weapon. 500 kilotons is roughly 33 Hiroshimas. It is also a fraction of 1% of Ivy Mike's yield. The way past the ceiling had been suggested in the autumn of 1941 during a casual conversation between 2 émigré physicists at Columbia University. Enrico Fermi, the Italian Nobel laureate, mentioned to his Hungarian colleague Edward Teller that the heat from a fission bomb might be intense enough to ignite a self-sustaining fusion reaction in the lightest of all elements, hydrogen. Inside the sun, hydrogen nuclei fuse into helium at temperatures of about 15 million degrees and crushing gravitational pressures, releasing far more energy per kilogram than fission ever could. If you could briefly create solar conditions on Earth using a fission bomb as the match, you would have, in theory, an essentially unlimited weapon. Teller was instantly fascinated. At the secret laboratory built in 1943 at Los Alamos, New Mexico, J. Robert Oppenheimer assembled the team that would build the fission bomb. Teller came too, but his attention kept drifting away from what he considered just an atomic bomb and toward what he called the super, his personal term for what would become the hydrogen bomb. He clashed with division head Hans Bethe over priorities. He refused to do critical calculations on the implosion mechanism of the plutonium bomb, forcing Bethe to bring in another scientist, a British physicist named Klaus Fuchs, to take over the work. Teller was eventually removed from the theoretical division and allowed to pursue the super on his own. By the end of the war, the basic super concept, Pour fission heat directly into a tube of liquid deuterium and hope it ignites remained nothing more than scribbles on paper. When the war ended, almost every senior scientist at Los Alamos wanted to go home. Teller wanted to keep going. He was almost alone among the Manhattan Project veterans in believing that the next weapon must be built immediately. Most of his colleagues, Oppenheimer chief among them, had seen what their creation did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and concluded that the work was done. For 4 years, from 1945 to 1949, the United States held a nuclear monopoly. American intelligence estimated the Soviets would not match it until 1953 at the earliest. The British put the date at 1954. Both were spectacularly wrong. On August 29, 1949, at the Semipalatinsk test site in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, a 22-kiloton plutonium device mounted on a steel tower flashed into life. The Soviets called it First Lightning. The Americans would call it Joe 1. It was, almost atom for atom, a copy of Fat Man. The Americans had no idea it had happened until a weather reconnaissance plane out of Misawa Air Base in Japan flew a routine atmospheric sampling mission over the North Pacific on September 3rd and brought back filter paper saturated with fresh fission products. On September 9th, the Director of Central Intelligence, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, handed President Truman a cautiously worded report of abnormal radioactive contamination. On September 23rd, after weeks of agonized debate, Truman announced to the world that the United States had evidence that within recent weeks an atomic explosion had occurred in the Soviet Union. The shock in Washington was profound. The American monopoly was gone 4 years ahead of schedule. Then on February 2nd, 1950 came the second hammer blow. Scotland Yard arrested Klaus Fuchs, the German-born British theoretical physicist who had worked at Los Alamos throughout the Manhattan Project. Fuchs confessed. He had been passing secrets to Soviet military intelligence since 1941, first to the GRU and later, after his transfer to the Manhattan Project, to the NKGB, the civilian intelligence service that would eventually become the KGB. The damage Fuchs had done was almost incalculable. He had been present at the Trinity test. He had passed his Soviet courier, a Philadelphia chemist named Harry Gold, the implosion mechanism of Fat Man, the specifications of the plutonium core, details of uranium enrichment, and, perhaps most consequentially, the early American thinking on the super, including a detailed description of the design that the Soviets came to call the classical super. Fuchs himself estimated he had accelerated the Soviet atomic program by at least 1 year. The hydrogen bomb information was already in Moscow. Inside the American government, the Fuchs revelation was weaponized to push a decision Truman had been resisting. Lewis Strauss, the conservative businessman on the Atomic Energy Commission, and Senator Brian McMahon of the Joint Congressional Atomic Energy Committee argued that America must immediately initiate a crash program to build a hydrogen bomb. They were joined by 3 of the most prominent physicists in the country. Edward Teller, who had been agitating for the super since 1942, Ernest Lawrence, the Nobel laureate director of the Berkeley Radiation Laboratory, and Luis Alvarez, Lawrence's protégé and another future Nobel winner. Lawrence and Alvarez had been ski touring in Northern California when news of the Soviet test broke. By late September 1949, they were touring laboratories, lobbying Congress, and writing letters. Alvarez later testified that he had expected Oppenheimer, his former wartime chief, to join them enthusiastically. Instead, he found Oppenheimer firmly opposed. On October the 29th and 30th, 1949, the Atomic Energy Commission's General Advisory Committee met in Washington to decide what to recommend to the president. The committee chair was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Its members included James Conant, president of Harvard, and Oppenheimer's wartime overseer, Enrico Fermi, Formsim Rabi, the Nobel-winning physicist from Columbia, Lee Dubridge, president of Caltech, and several other distinguished scientists. Glenn Seaborg, the 8th scientific member, was in Sweden and absent, a fact that would later be wielded against Oppenheimer. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The committee recommended strongly against an all-out effort to develop a weapon whose energy release would be 100 to 1,000 times greater than existing bombs. The reasons were both technical and moral. They judged that the super, if built, would have a destructive radius far beyond any conceivable military target. Such a weapon, the committee wrote, goes far beyond any military objective and enters the range of very great natural catastrophes. Fermi and Rabi went even further. In an addendum that has come to be called the Minority Report, they wrote that the fact that no limits exist to the destructiveness of this weapon makes its very existence a danger to humanity as a whole. They called it necessarily an evil thing considered in any light. This was the document that 4 years later would be used to destroy Oppenheimer's career. The political machinery overrode them. Truman convened a 3-man special committee of the National Security Council: Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, and the Atomic Energy Commission Chairman David Lilienthal. Acheson reportedly told a colleague that you cannot persuade a paranoid adversary to disarm by example. Lilienthal held out alone. On January 31st, 1950, the committee unanimously recommended that the program proceed. That same afternoon, Truman signed off. 3 days later, on February 2nd, Fuchs was arrested and the espionage became public, intensifying the sense of crisis that had driven the decision. Within hours, the president issued a terse public statement. "It is part of my responsibility as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces to see to it that our country is able to defend itself against any possible aggressor. Accordingly, I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen or superbomb." But there was a problem nobody on the special committee seems to have appreciated. As of January 31st, 1950, no one actually knew how to build a hydrogen bomb. Truman had committed the United States to a weapon that, on the best available physics, could not be made. For more than a year after Truman's directive, Los Alamos labored without progress. The classical super that Teller had championed since 1942, pump heat from a fission bomb directly into a long cylinder of liquid deuterium and hope a fusion wave propagates, kept failing on paper. The mathematician Stanislaw Ulam, working with the Polish-born physicist Cornelius Everett, ran a brutal series of hand calculations through 1950 that demonstrated the classical super would not ignite. The deuterium would cool faster than the heat could be delivered. Teller, who had staked his entire career on the super, refused to accept it. Tensions at Los Alamos became poisonous. Then, in late January or early February 1951, the exact date is still disputed among historians, Ulam walked into Teller's office with a sketch. What Ulam proposed was deceptively simple. Instead of trying to ignite the fusion fuel by raw heat from a nearby fission explosion, separate the fission bomb from the fusion fuel inside a single casing. Use the mechanical shockwave from the fission bomb to compress the fusion fuel to enormous density before it had time to disassemble. Compression, not heat, was the key. Teller initially resisted. Then, within hours, he proposed a critical improvement. Instead of using the mechanical shockwave, use the X-ray radiation from the fission bomb, which travels at the speed of light and arrives at the fusion fuel far faster than any physical shock ever could. The radiation would vaporize the outer surface of the fusion assembly, and the recoil, like a rocket exhaust pushing inward, would crush the fusion fuel and an internal spark plug of plutonium to densities far beyond solid. The compressed plutonium would go critical, igniting fission inside the deuterium, which would heat the fuel to fusion temperatures from within. This was staged radiation implosion, the Teller-Ulam design. It was elegant, brutal, and, in retrospect, almost inevitable. The two men wrote it up in a classified paper dated March 9th, 1951. The paper remains heavily redacted to this day. Who deserves credit has been argued for 75 years. Hans Bethe offered what may be the most balanced summary. Ulam is the father, Bethe said, because he provided the seed, and Teller is the mother, because he remained with the child. Teller himself was characteristically blunt. In a 1999 interview, he claimed full credit and insisted Ulam had contributed nothing. When the design was presented at a meeting in Princeton in June 1951, Oppenheimer himself, who had spent 2 years calling the project unfeasible, immediately recognized its elegance. Years later, during his 1954 security hearing, he would describe the moment by saying that when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. That admission would be used against him. The breakthrough was real, but it was still theory. Someone had to build the thing. In October 1951, Los Alamos director Norris Bradbury handed the engineering effort to Marshall Holloway, a quiet, methodical physicist with a reputation for getting things done. The committee directing the design was named with characteristic Los Alamos whimsy, the Panda Committee. It was led by Canadian-born theorist J. Carson Mark, head of the theoretical division. Teller, furious at being passed over for the leadership, formally withdrew from the project and within months was lobbying the Atomic Energy Commission to create a second weapons laboratory, what would become the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. The Teller versus Los Alamos rivalry would shape American nuclear weapons design for the next half-century. Teller refused to attend the Mike test. He said he did not feel welcome at the Pacific Proving Grounds. On the morning of the shot, he was 5,000 miles away in the basement of a building at the University of California, Berkeley, staring at a seismometer. The device the Panda Committee built was, in every literal sense, a building. The sausage was a cylindrical steel casing 80 inches in diameter and 244 inches tall, with walls 10 to 12 inches thick. It was the largest single steel forging produced in the United States to that time. Inside, at one end, sat a fission bomb as the primary stage. The fusion stage at the other end was an insulated steel dewar flask, essentially a giant thermos bottle, nearly 7 feet across and more than 20 feet tall. It held approximately 1,000 litres of liquid deuterium, cooled to within a few degrees of absolute zero. Running down the centre of the flask was a plutonium spark plug rod. The flask was wrapped in a 5 metric ton natural uranium tamper, whose fast fission, ignited by the fusion neutrons, would end up providing most of the device's yield. The interior of the steel casing was lined with sheets of lead and polyethylene to form the radiation channel that would route the X-rays from the primary down the length of the cylinder to the secondary. With its cryogenic plumbing attached, refrigeration lines, liquid hydrogen coolant and instrumentation, the total assembly weighed approximately 82 short tons. To keep the deuterium liquid, engineers built a small industrial complex on the atoll, a cryogenic plant to manufacture and chill the deuterium, a 3,000 kilowatt power station to run the refrigeration equipment, and a network of helium and hydrogen lines that snaked across the lagoon from island to island. Soviet engineers later sneered that Mike was not a bomb but a thermonuclear installation. They were not entirely wrong. You could not have dropped Ivy Mike out of any aircraft in existence. You could barely get it onto the island. The engineering of the secondary stage was largely the work of a brilliant 23-year-old former graduate student of Fermi's named Richard Garwin. Teller, who had been Garwin's informal mentor at the University of Chicago, had asked him to sketch out an experimental device that would conclusively test the radiation implosion concept. Garwin completed his design in the summer of 1951. It was, in his own later words, deliberately conservative, overbuilt, oversized, but virtually guaranteed to work if the underlying physics was right. The diagnostic systems were as ambitious as the bomb itself. To capture the gamma rays and neutrons emerging from the device before the casing vaporized, engineers built an extraordinary structure called the Krauss-Ogle box. It was a 9-foot square aluminum and plywood tunnel, 9,000 feet long, filled with helium-inflated balloon segments to keep the optical path transparent. It stretched across the reef from Elugelab through the neighbouring islands of Taita and Bogayrik to instrumentation bunkers on Bogon. High-speed cameras, light pipes, X-ray spectrometers, every measuring device that Los Alamos and the Naval Research Laboratory could ship to the Pacific, all of it was ranged along the atoll, pointed at a device that would exist for only a few millionths of a second. The Ivy Mike device was the product of perhaps 3,000 engineers, technicians, and machinists. By late October 1952, the sausage stood in its corrugated aluminum shot cab on Elugelab, plumbed into the cryogenic plant, surrounded by miles of cable and instrumentation, ready to die. To grasp what Ivy Mike did, you have to understand where it happened. Enewetak Atoll is a ring of 40 small coral islands in the Marshall Islands in the western Pacific, roughly 2,400 miles southwest of Honolulu. The atoll encloses a lagoon roughly 50 miles in circumference. The total dry land was less than 6 square kilometers, about twice the area of New York's Central Park, spread across 40 separate dots of sand. The highest natural point was 16 feet above the sea. Humans had lived on Enewetak for at least 3,000 years. The first European to record sighting it was the Spanish navigator Álvaro de Saavedra Cherón in 1529, who called the islands Los Jardines, the Gardens. The Germans took the Marshalls as a protectorate in 1885. Japan seized them in 1914, governed them under a League of Nations mandate, and built an airstrip on Engabi Island during the Second World War. In February 1944, American Marines and Army troops took the atoll from the Japanese in a 5-day amphibious battle. The Enewetak people, who had endured Japanese militarization and near starvation during the war, regarded the Americans initially as liberators. In December 1947, the American military governor of the Marshall Islands informed the approximately 150 residents that they would be relocated. They were told the move would be temporary, perhaps 3 to 5 years. They were taken to Elugelab Atoll, a smaller, poorer atoll with limited freshwater and food sources, and left there with inadequate supplies. They would remain in exile for 33 years. By the late 1960s, the Enewetak community on Elugelab was so desperate that they attempted to commandeer a visiting government supply ship, demanding to be taken home. Malnutrition was chronic. Children went largely uneducated. Their traditional knowledge of the waters, reefs, and navigation routes, accumulated over millennia, began to wither. In April 1980, the United States finally allowed roughly 450 descendants to return to the southern islands of the atoll. The northern islands, including Runit, were too contaminated for resettlement and remain so to this day. Between 1948 and 1958, the United States conducted 43 nuclear tests at Enewetak. The total combined yield was greater than every conventional explosion in human history put together. Ivy Mike was the largest of them all up to that point. Through October 1952, the weather refused to cooperate. Joint Task Force 132 had on average only a handful of days per month when winds, cloud cover, and tidal conditions all aligned for a safe shot. A delay also presented a political problem. November the 4th was the American presidential election, and the Eisenhower-Stevenson race was close. Truman, a Democrat in his final months in office, did not want a thermonuclear detonation to influence the vote. Atomic Energy Commission member Eugene Zuckert was dispatched to Enewetak with quiet instructions to find a technical reason to slip the test past Election Day. He could not. The weather window opened on November the 1st. There was one final attempt to stop the test entirely. The State Department panel of consultants on disarmament, chaired by none other than J. Robert Oppenheimer, recommended in late September 1952 that the test be delayed indefinitely. The panel proposed that the United States offer the Soviet Union a mutual no-first-test agreement. The logic was straightforward. Since the Soviets were at least a year behind in thermonuclear development, an agreement at the brink of testing would freeze the genie in the bottle on both sides while permitting rapid resumption if anyone cheated. Truman, Acheson, and the Joint Chiefs declined. The panel's report was delivered instead to President-elect Eisenhower in January 1953, 2 months after Mike had already vaporized Elugelab. On the day before the test, the 9,500 personnel of the Land Task Force were evacuated to ships. Roughly 12,000 men of Joint Task Force 132 watched from a fleet stationed 30 to 50 miles south of Ground Zero. Aboard the Estes, naval officers issued high-density goggles to every observer. The civilian research vessel Horizon, the only civilian ship in the task force, carrying oceanographers including Walter Munk, was positioned north of Ground Zero to monitor for a possible tsunami. The Scripps oceanographers had warned the Atomic Energy Commission that a 10-megaton surface burst on a coral reef might, in theory, trigger a submarine landslide that could produce a tidal wave capable of striking distant Pacific shores. The probability was judged small, but not zero. At 05:30 hours local time, the diagnostic systems were armed. The countdown timer was started. Aboard the Estes, a momentary power glitch threw the timing sequence off by half a second. And then it happened. 7:14 and 59.4 seconds local time. 19:14 and 59.4 seconds. Greenwich Mean Time, October the 31st, 1952. What happened in the next few millionths of a second has been described, but never adequately. The fission primary fired first. Within microseconds, X-rays at a temperature of tens of millions of degrees flooded the radiation channel between the primary and the lead-lined casing wall, then turned inward toward the cylindrical secondary. The polyethylene lining instantly vaporized into ionized plasma. The X-rays ablated the outer surface of the uranium tamper, and the recoil of that ablating surface drove the entire fusion package inward in symmetric implosion. The plutonium spark plug at the center of the flask reached densities several times that of solid metal. It went prompt critical and ignited fission inside the now compressed liquid deuterium. The deuterium nuclei, heated to roughly 100 million degrees and pressed to densities orders of magnitude beyond ordinary liquid, began to fuse. The high-energy neutrons from the fusion plasma then poured outward into the natural uranium tamper, fissioning the uranium-238. Approximately 77% of the yield, about 8 megatons, came not from fusion but from this fast fission of the uranium tamper. Only about 2.4 megatons came from the deuterium burn itself. Ivy Mike was, in effect, a thermonuclear bomb whose final stage was a giant dirty fission bomb. It would shower the Pacific with radioactive debris. The total yield was 10.4 megatons. The fireball reached a maximum diameter of about 3.2 miles while still near the surface, then rose and expanded further. Close to the fireball, lightning discharges were rapidly triggered. The mushroom stem was a column of vaporized coral, seawater, and what had been the island of Elugelab. In 90 seconds, the cloud reached 57,000 feet well into the stratosphere. 1 minute later, it was at 108,000 feet. Eventually, it stabilized at approximately 135,000 feet and spread to an anvil 100 miles wide with a stem 20 miles across. By 30 minutes after the shot, the mushroom stretched 60 miles in diameter. The shockwave reached the observation fleet about 6 minutes after the flash. Walter Munk on his raft recorded a 5 millibar airshock arriving as a sharp report, followed by angry rumbling. Aboard the Estes, observers described the tremendous fireball expanding rapidly after a momentary hover, its light so intense that men 30 miles away could feel the heat through their clothing. A second observer, quoted later in an army documentary, said simply, "You would swear that the whole world was on fire." When a helicopter reconnaissance flew over Ground Zero approximately 1 hour later, Elugelab was not there. Where the island had been, there was now an enormous underwater crater, more than a mile across and over 16 stories deep, already flooding with ocean water. The surrounding islands had been stripped clean of every tree, every shrub, every blade of vegetation. Water waves up to 20 feet high had washed across them. Radioactive coral debris fell on ships 35 miles distant. The Atomic Energy Commission chairman, Gordon Dean, later reported the outcome to President-elect Eisenhower in 5 chilling words. The island of Elugelab is missing. Edward Teller, in the basement at Berkeley, watched the seismometer's stylus jerk. He immediately sent a telegram to Dr. Elizabeth Graves, the head of the small team Los Alamos had left behind during the test. The telegram contained 3 words. It's a boy. Approximately 90 minutes after the detonation, 4 F-84G Thunderjets of Red Flight, led by Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Maroney, banked toward the still radiant mushroom cloud. Their cigar-shaped wingtip fuel tanks had been replaced with sealed filter pods designed to scoop up airborne debris. The pilots wore lead-lined jackets in place of life preservers. The mission was atomic cloud sampling, one of the most dangerous tasks in the early nuclear age. Maroney and his wingman entered the cloud stem at about 40,000 feet. Maroney described the interior in his mission report as a red glow, like the inside of a red-hot furnace. His radiation gauges spun, he reported, like the sweep second-hand on a watch. After 5 minutes, the instruments had hit their maximum reading. Whatever was in the stem of the cloud exceeded everything the gauges could measure. 4 minutes later, Captain Jimmy Robinson and his wingman Bob Hagan made their approach. Inside the cloud, Robinson hit severe turbulence. His autopilot disengaged. His jets stalled. Flight leader Maroney heard heavy breathing over the radio, as if Robinson was holding down his microphone button while fighting to control the aircraft. Robinson reported that he had recovered at 20,000 feet, but the electromagnetic after-effects of the hydrogen bomb were scrambling his instruments and navigation. In rain and poor visibility, neither Robinson nor Hagan could locate the tanker aircraft to refuel. Both were dangerously low on fuel. Hagan managed an extraordinary deadstick landing on the runway at Enewetak. Robinson was too far out. He attempted to ditch in the ocean. His jet hit a wave and flipped over. The rescue helicopter arrived about 1 minute later. Robinson's plane had already sunk. His body was never recovered. Captain Jimmy Priestley Robinson was 28 years old. He had survived being shot down over Romania during the Second World War and spending nearly 12 weeks as a prisoner of war. He left behind a wife and a baby daughter. A memorial stone bearing his name was erected at Arlington National Cemetery 50 years later in 2002. The filter samples that Robinson's wingman brought back proved to be one of the most consequential scientific specimens in history. At Los Alamos, chemists detected the isotopes plutonium-244 and plutonium-246, 44 and plutonium-246, confirming that some uranium atoms in the sausage's tamper had absorbed an extraordinary number of neutrons in rapid succession before decaying. A team at the University of California, Berkeley, chemist Albert Ghiorso, Stanley Gerald Thompson, and Nobel laureate Glenn Seaborg obtained half of one filter paper. Within weeks, they had detected two previously unknown elements, atomic numbers 99 and 100. The discovery was classified for almost 3 years. In 1955, the new elements were named in honor of Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi, Einsteinium and Fermium, two entries on the periodic table born from the heart of a hydrogen bomb. The Atomic Energy Commission tried to keep Ivy Mike secret. They almost succeeded. For 3 days after the test, American newspapers ran nothing. On November the 4th, Dwight Eisenhower won the presidency. On November the 5th and 6th, the papers were full of post-election coverage. On the 7th, a few small items began hinting at a large explosion somewhere in the Pacific. On November the 8th, a full week after Elugelab vanished, the Los Angeles Examiner published a story based on an anonymous eyewitness aboard the Estes. The leaks came not from press conferences but from 16 private letters mailed by personnel of Joint Task Force 132 to wives, fiancés, and friends, some of which found their way into local newspapers. By late November, the basic outline of Ivy Mike was public, though the Atomic Energy Commission would not formally confirm the existence of the hydrogen bomb for several more weeks. Within the government, debate immediately began over whether to declassify the spectacular film footage captured by Lookout Mountain Laboratory, the Air Force's secret motion picture unit based in Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles. Eisenhower received a private screening. He was reportedly shaken. The censored film, with dramatic music and narration, was finally released to the public in 1954. In Moscow, the news of Ivy Mike was a thunderclap. The Soviet thermonuclear program had been led since 1948 by a group headed by Igor Tamm that included a young prodigy named Andrei Sakharov. Working partly from Fuchs's leaked descriptions of the American classical super, Soviet theorists had concluded, as the Americans had, that the classical design would not work. They went their own way. Sakharov proposed what he called the sloika, the layer cake. It consisted of alternating spherical layers of fusion fuel and natural uranium, surrounded by a conventional fission primary. Another Soviet physicist, Vitaly Ginzburg, added a crucial insight. Instead of liquid deuterium, use solid lithium-6 deuteride, a compound that produces tritium during the explosion when bombarded by neutrons, and is solid at room temperature. No cryogenic plumbing required. The Soviets tested the layer cake on August 12, 1953 at Semipalatinsk. The Americans gave it the code name Joe 4. Its yield was about 400 kilotons, roughly 20 times that of Hiroshima, but only 1/26th of Ivy Mike. Crucially, however, Joe 4 was deliverable. It could be carried by a Soviet long-range bomber. Ivy Mike, with its cryogenic plumbing and 82-ton mass, was a science experiment. Joe 4 was a weapon. The American response was furious. Within Los Alamos and the new Livermore laboratory, the race shifted to building a deliverable Teller-Ulam device using solid lithium deuteride. The result, 14 months after Ivy Mike, was Castle Bravo, detonated on Bikini Atoll on March 1, 1954. Its predicted yield was 6 megatons. Its actual yield was 15 megatons, more than 2.5 times what its designers expected. They had assumed lithium-7 in the natural lithium fuel would be inert. It was not. The extra neutrons it released drove a runaway cascade. Castle Bravo became and remains the largest nuclear device the United States has ever detonated. It was also one of the worst radiological accidents in American history. An unexpected wind shear blew the fallout eastward instead of north, drenching the inhabited atolls of Rongelap and Elugelab. The Marshallese inhabitants were not evacuated for 48 hours. Many suffered acute radiation sickness, hair loss, and skin burns. Long-term studies would document elevated rates of thyroid disease, miscarriage, and cancer for decades afterward. 80 miles east of Bikini, the Japanese tuna trawler Daigo Fukuryu Maru, known in English as Lucky Dragon No. 5, was outside the official danger zone but directly in the fallout plume. White ash drifted onto her deck for hours. The 23 crew members scooped it off by hand. All developed acute radiation sickness. 6 months later, the chief radio operator, Eikichi Kuboyama, died at age 40. He is widely regarded as the first casualty of a hydrogen bomb. The Lucky Dragon incident detonated Japanese anti-nuclear politics. In Tokyo, a film producer named Tomoyuki Tanaka, traveling home from a failed shoot in Indonesia, conceived a story about a giant prehistoric creature awakened from the sea by an American hydrogen bomb test. The film became Gojira, released in November 1954. Godzilla, the monster that would become a global cultural icon, was, in a literal sense, a child of Castle Bravo. Atomic Energy Commission Chairman Lewis Strauss, briefing President Eisenhower's press secretary, suggested that the Lucky Dragon might have been a Soviet spy outfit deliberately exposing its crew to embarrass the United States. He told reporters that a hydrogen bomb could destroy any city. The Soviets achieved a true two-stage Teller Ulam weapon on November 22, 1955. By 1961, they would test the largest nuclear device ever exploded, the 50-megaton Tsar bomber, roughly 5 times the yield of Ivy Mike. Sakharov himself, who had been awarded 3 Hero of Socialist Labour medals for his weapons work, would by the late 1960s become the Soviet Union's most prominent dissident and, in 1975, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He wrote in his memoirs that after successfully testing a hydrogen device, he had toasted with a general and expressed the hope that the weapons would never be used over cities. The general replied that such decisions were not for scientists to make. Sakharov wrote simply, "I will never forget what I felt at that moment." 18 months after Ivy Mike, in a small windowless room at the Atomic Energy Commission's offices in Washington, J. Robert Oppenheimer sat across from a panel of 3 men reviewing whether to revoke his security clearance. The hearing in April and May of 1954 was not technically a trial. There was no judge, no jury, no formal rules of evidence, but it functioned as one. The lead attorney methodically dismantled Oppenheimer's recollection of the October 1949 Advisory Committee meeting. He demonstrated that prominent physicists had urgently lobbied for the hydrogen bomb program while Oppenheimer had quietly worked to delay it. The most damaging testimony came from Edward Teller. Asked whether Oppenheimer was disloyal, Teller said he did not want to suggest anything of the kind and that he believed Oppenheimer was loyal to the United States. But then he added the sentence that destroyed his standing in the physics community for the rest of his life. If it is a question of wisdom and judgment, as demonstrated by actions since 1945, then I would say one would be wiser not to grant clearance. Oppenheimer's clearance was revoked on June 29, 1954. The Personnel Security Board had recommended against him by a vote of 2-1. The full Atomic Energy Commission then confirmed the decision by a vote of 4-1. He never again held a position in nuclear policy. In December 2022, 68 years after the revocation, the United States Secretary of Energy formally vacated the original decision, citing a flawed process that violated the Commission's own regulations. Oppenheimer had been dead for 55 years. Teller had been dead for 19. Ivy Mike crossed a threshold that has not been recrossed since. Before November 1, 1952, nuclear weapons were city killers. After it, they were civilization killers. A single device of the type tested at Enewetak could destroy not a neighborhood, but an entire metropolitan region, and its fallout could spread radiation across continents. Within a decade, both superpowers had stockpiled thousands of such weapons mounted on intercontinental missiles. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction was, in a meaningful sense, born on Elugelab. Strategic theorists drew the obvious conclusion. The Yale political scientist Bernard Brodie had argued already in 1946 that thus far the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars, and from now on its chief purpose must be to avert them. Ivy Mike turned that argument from speculation into iron necessity. The hydrogen bomb was a weapon whose only conceivable rational use was non-use, a permanent shadow cast against being attacked. If you could destroy your enemy's civilization in an afternoon, and your enemy could do the same to yours, then the only rational strategy was to ensure that no one ever pressed the button. The arms race that followed produced, by some estimates, over 70,000 nuclear warheads at the global peak in the mid-1980s, the great majority of them thermonuclear Teller Ulam designs. Albert Einstein, by then in the final months of his life, told a visitor in 1954 that he had made one great mistake in his life when he signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made. But there had been some justification, he added. The danger that the Germans would make them first. Hans Bethe, who had directed the theoretical division at Los Alamos during the war and reluctantly returned in 1952 to work on Mike, later said he had hoped throughout 1951 that the hydrogen bomb would prove impossible. When the Teller Ulam design succeeded, he was deeply ambivalent about his own role. He spent the remaining decades of his life until his death in 2005 advocating for arms control. Today, Elugelab is a hole in the sea. The crater is still clearly visible in satellite imagery, a circular blue depression on the northern rim of Enewetak Atoll, partially silted in, surrounded by reef. Sediment cores taken from the crater in the 2010s contained the highest concentrations of plutonium, 239 and 240 measured anywhere in the global ocean. 800 meters to the southwest, on the island of Runit, sits another monument to the thermonuclear age. The Runit Dome, locally called the Tomb, is a reinforced concrete cap of 358 panels, each 18 inches thick, sealing approximately 100,000 cubic yards of plutonium-contaminated soil and debris. The radioactive material was poured into a crater left by a 1958 test and entombed at a cost of roughly $239 million. A National Academy of Sciences report concluded that the dome's projected lifetime was, at best, 300 years. The plutonium it contains will remain dangerous for at least 24,000 years. Rising sea levels are now lapping at its base. Researchers have documented seawater seeping into the dome from below, suggesting the contained material may already be leaching into the lagoon. The Marshallese who returned in 1980 were resettled only on the southern islands. Northern Enewetak, including Runit and the area near the crater, remains quarantined. The Republic of the Marshall Islands has become one of the most diplomatically active small states on Earth, advocating both for nuclear compensation and for climate justice, twinned legacies, in their view, of a single American century. There are no Marshallese in the surviving footage of Ivy Mike. There is no narration of the displaced. The Lookout Mountain film, declassified and beautiful and terrible, shows only the cloud. Edward Teller died on September 9, 2003, at age 95. To the end, he claimed that he, not Ulam, deserved the credit. Stanislaw Ulam died in 1984. His autobiography was largely about pure mathematics. J. Robert Oppenheimer died of throat cancer on February 18, 1967, at his home in Princeton. He had been selected by President Kennedy for the Enrico Fermi Award in 1963, though it was President Johnson who presented it after Kennedy's assassination. Teller attended the ceremony. He extended his hand. Kitty Oppenheimer, watching, refused to shake it. Andrei Sakharov died on December 14, 1989, in Moscow, weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Marshallese remain. On Majuro, on Hawaii, on Ujalang, on the southern islands of Enewetak, and increasingly scattered across the world. Every year, on March 1st, they observe Nuclear Remembrance Day, marking the anniversary of Castle Bravo. Some also mark November 1st, the anniversary of the morning Elugelab disappeared. Walter Monk, the oceanographer who had felt the heat on his face from 50 miles away aboard his tiny raft, lived until 2019. He once said of that morning, "I will not forget the boiling sky overhead." In the basement at Berkeley, on the morning of November 1st, 1952, as the seismometer needle had begun to twitch, Edward Teller had reached for a pencil and a Western Union form. He addressed it to Elizabeth Graves at Los Alamos. "It's a boy. The buoy was 10.4 megatons. The buoy is 73 years old this November. It has not yet been used in war. It is still here,